millionaire Henry Wallace hosted a lavish dinner to impress foreign investors. But when the hired translator failed to show up, the hall descended into chaos. It was then that a 13-year-old boy, the cleaning lady's son, stepped forward and said, "I can translate, sir." Everyone laughed, including Henry himself. But seconds later, the laughter turned to silence. In front of dozens of millionaires, the boy began to speak French, Italian, German, and even Russian with a fluency that no one could have imagined. And that night, the arrogant millionaire discovered that the greatest wealth can be born in the most unlikely places. The glass skyscraper that housed Wallace Technologies' headquarters stood as a symbol of power in the heart of Boston. On the top floor, where the CEO's office was located, everything reflected absolute control. Impeccable glass tables, leather chairs aligned to the millimeter, walls adorned with digital screens displaying real-time graphs. It was there that Henry Wallace, 47, had built his image as an unshakable man. With a tailored suit and a cold gaze, his presence was enough to silence entire rooms. Business colleagues admired him for the coolness with which he made decisions. Employees feared him for the same reason. For Henry, feelings were distractions. Results were the only acceptable metric. In the company corridors, his name was whispered with respect mixed with fear. Anyone who made a mistake in front of him rarely got a second chance. It was a world of inflexible discipline, where there was no room for improvisation. And this steely atmosphere shaped all who approached its sphere of power. Among his rules, one was known and repeated as a commandment. No one should disrupt his events or meetings with personal matters. He didn't accept excuses, much less tolerate unforeseen circumstances. "Business comes before everything else," was his maxim, said in the same tone with which he signed million-dollar contracts. The perfection of his public image depended on this rigidity. Events planned by him were treated like choreographed shows. Selected guests, exclusive menus, impeccable simultaneous translations. Nothing could tarnish the shine he so cultivated. And it was this obsession that turned Henry into a corporate legend, and also a target of veiled criticism. Many saw him as too arrogant, too distant, unable to see the humanity in ordinary situations. But for Henry, compassion was weakness, and in his mind only the strong survived at the top. What he didn't know was that soon, this conviction would be challenged by someone he never imagined he would face. As Henry reinforced his orders to the team in yet another morning briefing, the contrast became evident. On one side, the business elite gathered in luxurious rooms, discussing international investments. On the other side, in the same building, invisible to the CEO, was Eleanor Brooks, a 36-year-old cleaner who cleaned the hallways every day. To Henry, she was just part of the silent machinery that kept the empire running smoothly. For Eleanor, every hour in that building was a struggle for survival, for sustenance for the son who waited patiently for her. And it was precisely at this point where the two worlds met, the millionaire's empire and the cleaning lady's humility, that an unexpected story would begin to unfold. A story capable of turning upside down the rules that Henry believed were unshakable. And it all began with the unlikely courage of a 13-year-old boy named Noah Brooks. On the outskirts of Boston, far from the mirrored glass and golden chandeliers of Wallace Technologies, 36-year-old Eleanor Brooks's daily life was shaped by effort and resilience. The small apartment where she lived with her son was on the third floor of an old building, with peeling walls and narrow hallways that smelled of stale coffee and old wood. Despite its simplicity, every corner bore the touch of a devoted mother. Hand-sewn curtains, patiently refurbished furniture, and children's drawings pasted on the walls by Noah Brooks, her 13-year-old son. The boy was the center of her life, the reason she endured the long cleaning days in a cold and unforgiving environment. As she prepared her blue uniform, already worn from so much use, Eleanor thought about the fortune she cleaned daily without ever touching it. The same corridors that shone beneath her dedication were also the corridors that made her invisible to men like Henry Wallace. But this invisibility was only apparent. Inside the home, she was everything. She was mother, protector, and source of hope for her son who dreamed big. Noah, unlike most teenagers his age, wasn't distracted by games or social media. His fascination was something else. Languages. He spent hours with old books and scribbled notes in yellowed notebooks, repeating words in French, phrases in Italian, passages in German, and even dialogues in Russian. He was a natural self-taught person, absorbing knowledge wherever he could, even if it was from old magazines or videos recorded on public computers in the library. While Eleanor cleaned marble floors and huge windows at the company, Noah waited for her, sitting discreetly in the reception area, practicing silently, as if invisible to the executives who hurried past. But in his mind, each word he learned was one more step toward escaping the limited reality that surrounded him. He dreamed of being a translator, perhaps even a diplomat, someone who could cross borders with the power of language. And Eleanor, even though she was tired, encouraged this dream, because she knew that her son's talent was the greatest asset they had. At night, in the small apartment, mother and son shared a simple dinner, often just bread and thin soup. Still, there was always laughter and conversation. Eleanor asked about the new words Noah had learned that day, and he proudly showed her the scribbled pages of his notebook. For her, each answer was a spark of hope that life could be different. But deep down, he carried a constant worry: how to protect his son's talent in a world that so often crushed dreams like his. Every morning she woke up for another day of work. She promised herself that she wouldn't let Noah be invisible. What she didn't know was that this promise would soon be tested, on a night that would forever change not only their lives, but Henry Wallace's own. And it all began with a business dinner that seemed, at first glance, just another night of power and luxury. While most boys his age were playing in the streets or immersed in video games, 13-year-old Noah Brooks found enjoyment in something very different. In the small room he shared with his mother, the makeshift shelves were filled with used books, many of them rescued from donations or even from the trash. Old grammars, second-hand dictionaries, forgotten international magazines. Everything became raw material for his insatiable curiosity. With a pencil always in his pocket, he scribbled in worn notebooks with French words, Italian phrases, German passages, and even dialogues in Russian. He repeated it quietly until he memorized the pronunciation, recorded audio on the old cell phone he had inherited from a neighbor, and listened to it repeatedly. It was as if each language was a key opening doors to distant worlds he dreamed of one day visiting. Even without teachers, Noah built his own path, page by page, word by word. His talent wasn't just discipline. It was passion, burning within a young heart that saw beyond the cramped reality in which he lived. And while the world was not seeing him, he prepared himself in silence, honing the gift that would one day surprise everyone. At the reception desk of Wallace Technologies, where he waited for his mother at the end of the day, Noah became almost invisible. He sat in a side chair, always with his notebook open and his pen running over the pages. Hurrying executives passed him by without noticing, as if he were just part of the furniture. But behind those watchful eyes, there was an entire universe being built. He listened to fragments of conversations in different languages, observed the foreigners who visited the company, and silently translated each word to himself. It was a game he played every day, without anyone noticing. The security guards laughed discreetly when they saw the boy whispering in strange languages. But for Noah, this was no joke. It was training. It was the future. Eleanor, even exhausted, always smiled when she saw him absorbed in his studies. "You will go far, my son," she said in a low, proud voice. She knew that, although the world had not yet noticed, there was greatness hidden in that boy. On that particular evening, while Eleanor was cleaning polished glass corridors upstairs, Noah was writing lines in Russian in his notebook, testing the sound of the words. "I never imagined that this silent habit would soon become the center of attention." In a few days, there would be a business dinner that would bring together French, Italians, Germans, and Russians. A dinner where the absence of a translator would put million-dollar contracts at risk. And, in front of dozens of incredulous eyes, it would be precisely the invisible boy at reception who would break the silence. But at that moment, Noah didn't know that. I continued scribbling, practicing, delving into each language as if opening doors to broader horizons. Little could he have imagined that he was about to experience the most important night of his life. A night where all your effort would stop being invisible and become unforgettable. At the Wallace Technologies penthouse, everything had been set up to impress. The company's event hall glowed under the light of crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like carefully polished stars. Long tables were covered in crisp white tablecloths, lined with gleaming silver cutlery and crystal glasses. Arrangements of imported flowers perfumed the air, competing with the sophisticated aroma of dishes prepared by a renowned chef. It was the night when Henry Wallace, 47, would present to his international guests the grandeur of his empire. French, Italian, German, and Russian investors were already taking their places, each carrying discreet briefcases concealing million-dollar contracts. For Henry, nothing could fail. His pride was at stake as much as business. He walked around the room with firm steps, greeting guests in English, with the practiced smile of someone who commands not only the table, but the world. However, behind all the pomp, there was a breach ready to shatter the planned perfection. Eleanor Brooks, downstairs, was part of the last-minute cleanup crew. Dressed in her worn blue uniform, she discreetly followed the events without ever being noticed. His job was to ensure that nothing would break the aura of impeccability demanded by his boss. However, as he entered the room through the side door to collect empty glasses, his eyes fixed for a moment on his son, sitting in a distant chair. Noah Brooks, 13, watched the guests come and go curiously, notebook open on his lap, pen gliding with words that no one there could decipher. Eleanor sighed, torn between pride and worry. I knew Noah was different, special, but I also feared what might happen if he drew attention at the wrong time. In the mother's heart, a premonition throbbed. That night would not go unnoticed by her son, and the weight of that premonition followed her like an invisible shadow. As the dishes were served, the toasts were made, and the first contracts were discussed, an unexpected detail broke the perfect rhythm. The hired translator had not shown up. At first, Henry believed it was a simple delay, but as the conversations progressed, the problem became apparent. The French tried to make their points, the Italians were confused in their explanations, the Germans were gesturing irritably, and the Russians were mumbling among themselves, growing increasingly impatient. The language barrier grew like an invisible wall, threatening the prestige of the night. Henry, sitting at the head of the table, clenched his fists under the table. Nothing infuriated him more than losing control, and that was exactly what was happening before his eyes. The guests whispered, already uncomfortable with the situation, while the host began to feel his image of power crumble. It was just the beginning of the collapse, and no one imagined that the solution would come from the most unlikely corner of that room. The wall clock ticked away every minute as a cruel reminder of the looming failure. The translator hired for the grand dinner had not arrived, and now the elegant atmosphere turned into growing awkwardness. At the main table, A French investor was trying to explain a key point, but his words were lost in the air, without anyone fully understanding them. Soon after, an Italian businessman tried to intervene, gesturing impatiently, only to be interrupted by the German, who spoke in a harsh tone, irritated by the confusion. The Russians, in turn, exchanged short phrases among themselves, in a language that sounded even more inaccessible to most. It was as if each group was speaking a different language on the same stage, and the host, accustomed to absolute control, was about to lose control of his own party. The discomfort was palpable, growing like a fire that no one knew how to put out. And all this was happening under the increasingly tense gaze of Henry Wallace, who was sitting at the head of the table. Henry couldn't stand slips, and this one felt like a personal affront. His jaw clenched with each failed attempt at communication. The nervous laughter of the guests only served to intensify the pressure. He picked up the wine glass and slammed it down on the table, demanding silence. "Calm down, gentlemen," he said in English, even though he knew many wouldn't understand. But the authority that always worked in other environments had no effect there. The foreigners looked around impatiently, some exchanging looks of frustration. Henry ran his hand over his face, hiding his nervousness. Inside, he felt his carefully constructed image of the perfect host crumble in real time. It was like watching a string snap in mid-performance in front of hundreds of eyes. And the more he tried to control it, the more chaos spread across the table. At the side door, Eleanor Brooks watched silently, carrying a tray of empty glasses. She knew her boss well enough to realize that this wouldn't end well. The way he drummed his fingers on the table, the way he frowned, everything indicated he was about to explode. And as she looked over at the corner of the room, where Noah, her 13-year-old son, was scribbling words in his notebook with rapt attention, a chill ran down her spine. The boy sensed the chaos too, and his eyes shone with something Eleanor recognized: courage mixed with drive. She knew Noah wouldn't stay still for long, and the mere thought of him intervening terrified her. Because if Henry found out that the cleaning lady's son had tried to interfere in the most important meeting of the year, the humiliation could be devastating. But Noah, oblivious to his fear, was already beginning to close his notebook and settle into his chair. Eleanor held her breath. Something was about to happen that would change the course of that night. The hall, previously filled with the glow of chandeliers and the sound of toasting glasses, was now plunged into a heavy atmosphere. Henry Wallace, sitting at the head of the table, drummed his fingers against the glass table with visible impatience. His steely gaze roamed over every foreign face, trying to extract order from the spreading chaos. The Frenchman repeated phrases in a frustrated tone. The Italian raised his voice. The German gestured irritably, and the Russians were already showing signs of offense at the disorganization. Henry felt as if his company's prestige was being eroded in front of everyone, and this was something his pride could not tolerate. He stood up suddenly, his expensive jacket following him like a cloak of authority. "Gentlemen, we will have a solution soon," he said in English, knowing that most people would not understand. His tone was harsh, more of an order than a promise. But no one believed him. Expressions of impatience multiplied around the table. The reputation that Henry so cherished was hanging by a thread. At the side of the room, employees exchanged tense glances. Everyone knew that when Henry lost control, someone paid the price. The silence among the employees was almost deafening, as they feared that one wrong word would be enough for them to be blamed. Among them was Eleanor Brooks, who watched the scene with a heavy heart. She knew her boss well enough to foresee the storm. With every second, his anger grew, ready to boil over in public humiliation to anyone within earshot. And then Eleanor's eyes turned to the corner of the room. There was Noah Brooks, his 13-year-old son, with a closed notebook on his lap and a different determination in his eyes. He didn't seem to feel the same fear that paralyzed others. On the contrary, his face revealed a desire to act. Eleanor felt a shiver run up her spine, as if she sensed the inevitable. His instinct screamed to restrain his son, but Noah's courage was already moving on its own. Henry, realizing that nothing was being resolved, slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses vibrate. "This is unacceptable," he exclaimed, his face turning red with fury. The room fell into immediate silence, but it was not the silence of order, but of suffocating tension. The investors looked at each other, some already showing signs of giving up on their expressions. That night's failure seemed inevitable, and it was precisely at this moment of collapse that Noah stepped forward. With his heart racing, but his posture firm, the boy crossed part of the room. His voice was still low, but it carried a surprising conviction for someone his age. "I can translate, sir." The unexpected phrase cut through the heavy air of the room like lightning, and within seconds, the awkward silence gave way to mocking laughter that echoed throughout the luxurious ballroom. Laughter echoed through the room as if 13-year-old Noah Brooks's remark were a lame joke told at the wrong time. Executives in impeccable suits exchanged amused glances, some even shaking their heads in disbelief. The contrast was stark. A skinny teenager, the son of a cleaning lady, standing before international investors accustomed to million-dollar deals. "I can translate, sir," he repeated, this time in a firmer tone, ignoring the laughter around him. His heart was beating fast, but his eyes were fixed on Henry Wallace, the man who ruled that empire and, at the same time, the reason so many dreamed or gave up. Henry arched an eyebrow, somewhere between surprised and irritated, as if the boy's boldness were more serious than the chaos of the night. "You?" he said in a voice full of contempt, provoking new laughter from all around. The entire room seemed to conspire to crush Noah's courage. But the boy did not lower his head. He was determined to prove that he was not invisible, even if everyone wanted to believe otherwise. In the corner, Eleanor Brooks felt her legs weaken. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to run to her son and drag him back before he was irreversibly humiliated. But something paralyzed her. There was a strength in his eyes she had never seen before. It was the look of someone who was ready to face the impossible. She pressed her hands against her apron, tears already forming, torn between fear and pride. He knew Henry could destroy his dignity in seconds with just one sentence. And yet, Noah stood there, standing firm, in front of dozens of disbelieving eyes. The silence after the boy's second statement seemed heavier than the laughter. It was as if everyone was anxiously awaiting the cruel response that would come from the host. And when Henry opened his mouth, the sarcastic tone left no doubt about what was coming. "So now my company hires hallway interpreters too?" Henry said, laughing out loud, encouraging others to join in. The laughter returned, echoing through the luxurious hall. Some foreign guests, not understanding the joke, just followed the collective laughter, believing it was part of the scene. But Henry's mockery hid his impatience. He didn't believe that an ordinary boy, the son of a cleaning lady, could save his night. And precisely for that reason, he didn't mind ridiculing him in front of everyone. Noah, however, was not shaken. The blush of shame did not reach him, because he knew something that no one there imagined. His heart told him this was his chance to show the world who he was. And even in the face of laughter, he prepared to take the next step. The step that would make the entire room fall silent in seconds. The collective laughter echoed through the room like a cruel wave, each laugh reinforcing the inequality between those at the center of the table and those who dared to rise from the shadows. Henry Wallace, pleased with the mockery, raised his wine glass and smiled at the investors, as if he had just entertained his guests with a comic scene. Just imagine, the cleaning lady's son wanting to translate million-dollar agreements, he said sarcastically, provoking further laughter. The American guests were openly amused, while the foreigners, not fully understanding the irony, just went along with it, laughing along. In the corner of the room, some employees lowered their heads, embarrassed, and among them was Eleanor Brooks, the mother, her hands clasped tightly against her apron, feeling each laugh like a knife in her chest. The fear of seeing his son humiliated was devastating. Still, the determined look in 13-year-old Noah Brooks's eyes kept her from running to him. The boy didn't seem embarrassed. On the contrary, her eyes burned with a flame she didn't recognize, a courage born precisely in adversity. Noah remained standing, motionless before the audience that ridiculed him. He didn't look away, he didn't lower his head. He didn't let the laughter make him back away. Inside him, every word he had learned during long nights of study echoed like a shield. He wasn't there to prove anything to Henry or to the guests. He was there to honor himself, to show that his life's invisible efforts had value. As the laughter grew, his mind flashed back to the scribbled pages of notebooks, the hours in the library, the early mornings spent murmuring phrases in French, Italian, German, and Russian. Every memory was fuel, and in that instant, the boy seemed bigger than all the expensive suits around him. Henry, uncomfortable with the boy's firm posture, narrowed his gaze. I expected to see him blush with embarrassment and run away, but nothing like that happened. Noah stood, ready for the next move, and the silent tension that built beneath the laughter was a harbinger that something surprising was about to happen. The laughter began to fade, as some guests realized that the boy was not intimidated. The contrast was disconcerting. A skinny teenager holding his gaze in the eyes of one of the most powerful men in the city. The hall, previously filled with mockery, now oscillated between mockery and expectation. And it was at that moment that Noah took the first decisive step. In a clear voice, he turned to the French investor next to Henry and said an impeccable sentence in his language. The intonation, the rhythm, the pronunciation, everything was perfect. The hall froze. The investor's eyes widened in surprise, and he immediately responded in French, testing the boy. And when Noah returned the answer, without hesitation, a deathly silence filled the room. The laughter died suddenly. What had once seemed like a joke now turned into disbelief. And Henry Wallace, for the first time that night, didn't know how to react. The hall, which seconds before had echoed with laughter, was now plunged into absolute silence. All eyes were on Noah Brooks, 13, who had just spoken French with the ease of a native speaker. The surprised French investor leaned forward in his chair, his eyes shining with admiration. He asked a long question, laden with technical terms, as if testing the boy's limits. Noah responded calmly, translating the words into perfect English so everyone could understand. The impact was immediate. The room, previously filled with disbelief, was now open-mouthed. With each sentence, the boy's confidence grew. His firm voice carried through the luxurious hall as if he had finally found the place from which he should never have been removed. The center. The Frenchman smiled, impressed, and nodded, validating the talent that no one dared to question anymore. And the silence that followed was no longer one of mockery, but of respect. Henry Wallace, sitting at the head of the table, felt his blood run cold. His face hardened, but it was impossible to hide his surprise. His hands clenched on the table, and the cup before him trembled slightly. How dare that boy, the son of a cleaning lady, become the center of attention on her carefully planned evening? And worse, how did he manage to do it with such excellence? Embarrassment burned in his chest, but the guests no longer looked at him. They looked at Noah. Every word the boy said in French was a silent blow to the millionaire's pride. And the more fluent the boy became, the more evident it became that Henry had underestimated not only Noah, but also the mother who had raised him. The entire room began to realize that something extraordinary was happening before their eyes. And Henry, unable to stop himself, just watched his own authority being eroded by phrases he didn't understand. Eleanor Brooks, leaning against the side of the room, felt tears welling up in her eyes. His heart was beating fast, torn between fear and pride. She knew her son. She knew of his silent dedication, but seeing him shine like that in front of so many people was unimaginable. It was as if the world finally saw what she had always known, that Noah was special. The boy gestured lightly, translating complex expressions, without hesitation or stumbling. The French guests began to smile among themselves, exchanging looks of approval. Some even clapped discreetly, restrained by the formality of the evening, but unable to hide their delight. And Eleanor, her chest swelling with emotion, knew that this was only the beginning, because Noah still had more to show, and each language would be one more step towards transforming that night of humiliation into victory. The room was still silent with awe when 13-year-old Noah Brooks turned to one of the Italian businessmen. With a discreet smile, he began an impeccable greeting in his language, his voice firm and his pronunciation clear as if he had grown up in Rome. The investor's eyes widened in surprise and he responded enthusiastically, testing the boy with quick sentences full of typical gestures. Noah followed each word naturally, translating it into English accurately, without missing a single syllable. The guests' expressions changed rapidly, from disbelief to disbelief, and from disbelief to admiration. The laughter that had echoed minutes before seemed like a shameful mistake compared to the genius that was revealed. With each answer the boy gave, Henry Wallace's prestige diminished before his very eyes. He, accustomed to controlling all the attention, now watched a skinny teenager shine in his place. And the irony was cruel. That boy was precisely the son of the cleaning lady he ignored every day. A contrast that made the embarrassment increase with each second. The Italians began to laugh, but not in mockery. They laughed in satisfaction. One of them stood up, clapping and praising loudly, calling Noah a ragazzo prodigio. The international audience seemed increasingly fascinated by the boy. Even the Germans and Russians, still silent, watched with increasing attention, as if waiting their turn to witness the impossible. Noah, without missing a beat, maintained the composure of someone far beyond his years. The scribbled notebooks, the sleepless nights, the silent studies, everything seemed to converge in that moment. And with every word, his voice carried not only knowledge, but also dignity. It was as if translating were more than a technical act. It was living proof that talent has no origin, and that dreams don't need to ask permission to exist. The guests leaned forward, eager for more, and Eleanor, leaning against the corner, could no longer hold back her tears. He was watching his son turn humiliation into triumph in front of the entire elite who used to treat them as invisible. Henry Wallace, for his part, forced a bitter smile. The hand was gripping the crystal goblet so tightly that it seemed about to break. He tried to compose himself, but his cold gaze couldn't hide his discomfort. Noah was becoming the star of his night, and that was something Henry couldn't stand. Inside, his pride screamed at him to stop, but he couldn't do so without exposing himself even further. What was once a mockery now became a threat to his authority, his image, his position, and everyone present saw this clearly. But before the millionaire could even think to act, Noah had already turned to the Germans, ready to surprise them again. and the entire hall, held in anticipation, awaited the next language that would transform that night into something historic. The room was in suspense as 13-year-old Noah Brooks turned to the German businessman. He took a deep breath and began the conversation in German with a firm pronunciation, articulating long, complex words as if they were natural to him. The Germans, known for their toughness in negotiations, immediately leaned forward, impressed. One of them asked a question loaded with technical market terms, almost as a test to knock the boy down. But Noah responded calmly, translating into English flawlessly without hesitation. The investors nodded, exchanging looks of surprise and approval. It was as if they were in the presence of a prodigy, someone whose mind functioned as a living bridge between cultures. The previously hard expressions turned into discreet smiles. One of them even slammed his hand on the table as a sign of respect, muttering in German that the boy was unglaublich, unbelievable, and the echo of that word seemed to sum up what everyone there was feeling. As Noah demonstrated his fluency, the guests' eyes increasingly shifted away from Henry Wallace. The millionaire, previously the absolute protagonist of the night, had become an extra at his own party. A blush rose to her face, and her pursed lips barely concealed her irritation. It was like watching your image empire slowly being taken over by a skinny kid. Every answer Noah gave was like a direct blow to his pride. The entire room was no longer talking about the contracts, but about the boy's incredible skill. Some even whispered to each other, pointing at him with expressions of delight. And the brighter the boy shone, the more Henry felt dim. It was a role reversal I could never have imagined. And yet it was happening in front of everyone, without him having the power to stop it. Eleanor Brooks, leaning discreetly in the corner, felt the tears running freely down her face. The heart seemed to burst with pride. She saw in her son the materialization of all the sacrifices, of every hour of lost sleep, of every simple dish shared. Noah wasn't just a boy who knew languages. He was proof that no humble origins could extinguish the flame of true talent. She watched him with her hands clasped, as if she were witnessing a miracle. And for the first time that night, there was no fear in his chest, only the certainty that his son was destined for something greater. In the hall, the respectful silence grew with each word spoken in German, and everyone waited anxiously to see how far the boy's genius could go. Little did they know that the biggest surprise was yet to come, and that it would come in an even more unexpected language. The atmosphere was already filled with respect and surprise, but Noah Brooks, 13, had not yet shown everything he knew. With impressive calm, he turned to the Russian businessmen, who until then had remained more withdrawn, watching in silence. He greeted them in Russian, his firm, almost native pronunciation echoing through the luxurious hall. The first words drew incredulous looks. One of the Russians, suspicious, launched into a long, complex sentence, as if testing the boy's limits. But Noah responded immediately, translating accurately into English without losing rhythm or clarity. The other investors looked at each other, this time smiling with genuine admiration. One of them even let out a surprised laugh, exclaiming, "Impossible!" The entire hall followed in reverent silence, absorbing every word. The boy who minutes before was the butt of jokes now became the voice that united all the languages of the night. The reactions grew in intensity. The Russian guests stood, greeting Noah with warm handshakes, a rare gesture in such a formal setting. The room, previously marked by mockery and arrogance, now vibrated with spontaneous applause. Some foreigners applauded standing up, without caring about the event's etiquette. The contrast was powerful. Where before there had been laughter of derision, now there was applause of respect. And Noah, serene, maintained the posture of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, but still continued to surprise. He didn't just translate words, he conveyed confidence, dignity, and talent in every sentence. Pride radiated from his presence, infecting everyone around him, and the reverent silence of moments before turned into celebration. The skinny boy, son of a cleaning lady, had won the hearts of an entire room of millionaires and international investors, and the only one who seemed unable to move was Henry Wallace, frozen in place. Henry felt the ground give way beneath his feet. The party he had planned to display his power had become the stage for his silent humiliation. All eyes that should have been on him now belonged to the cleaning lady's son. The laughter he had previously encouraged had died on his lips, replaced by a tightness in his chest that he couldn't control. His pride was too heavy to admit, but there was no denying it. That boy had saved the night, and he did it in front of everyone, without asking for anything in return other than the chance to be heard. The applause continued to echo, and each clap sounded like a hammer blow to Henry's ego. It was impossible to go back, impossible to pretend nothing had happened. The entire room witnessed the truth. Power was not in fortune, but an unlikely talent that shone where no one expected it. And this shock would be the greatest lesson of Henry Wallace's life. After the applause, a heavy silence fell over the hall. It was no longer the silence of Henry Wallace's arrogance, but the silence of reverence. All the guests looked at 13-year-old Noah Brooks, as if still trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The skinny boy, who minutes before was the target of mockery, was now seen as a prodigy. The French exchanged delighted glances, the Italians smiled and chatted among themselves, the Germans nodded respectfully, and the Russians even murmured compliments. No one paid attention to the host anymore. All the brightness of the night was concentrated on the boy who had translated perfectly. Noah remained standing, breathing deeply, but maintaining a calm posture, without displaying arrogance. He was just a boy, but he radiated a greatness that no amount of wealth could buy. The contrast was so evident that even the previously invisible employees watched it with silent pride. It was as if the entire hierarchy in that room had been turned upside down. Henry Wallace, motionless at the head of the bed, felt the weight of dozens of eyes that no longer saw him as absolute leader. His ego, built over years of power and discipline, was wavering for the first time. He clutched the glass tightly, but he knew that no gesture could regain the lost control. If he tried to ridicule Noah again, he would expose himself to even more ridicule. If he recognized the boy's talent, he would have to swallow his pride in front of everyone. That crossroads suffocated him. Every second of silence increased the pressure, and the guests waited anxiously for a reaction. The millionaire who had always had an answer for everything now seemed speechless. And this unprecedented vulnerability was even more impactful than any harsh words could have been. It was as if everyone was witnessing the fall of a mask, and no one wanted to look away at that moment. Eleanor Brooks watched from the sidelines, her heart still racing. His hands were shaking, but it was from emotion, not fear. Seeing his son respected in that way was like watching an impossible dream come true. She saw there not only Noah's talent, but also the reflection of all the sacrifices made in silence. The nights of work, the simple meals, the whispered words of encouragement so he wouldn't give up. Everything culminated in that moment, in front of the most powerful men who now looked at her differently. And even if Henry tried to extinguish that glow, it was too late. The entire hall had been conquered by Noah, and there was no turning back. The dignity that had been denied to him so many times was being returned to him in front of everyone. And that silence, filled with expectation, was proof that nothing would be the same again. Henry's next move would define not only his image, but the very lesson of that night. Silence still hung over the room when Eleanor Brooks, 36, took a hesitant step forward. She wasn't the center of attention. She never had been. But at that moment she couldn't remain in the shadows. Clutching her apron with trembling hands, she looked up at the guests and then at Henry Wallace, the man who had so often treated her as if invisible. His voice was quiet at first, but firm. "My son didn't ask for permission to exist, Mr. Wallace. He simply showed what he always was. A dedicated boy who worked hard to teach himself what many only learn at expensive universities." The hall, still in anticipation, fell into a respectful silence. The gazes now divided between mother and son, as if witnessing not only talent, but also courage. Eleanor took a deep breath, the tears in her eyes shining in the golden light of the chandeliers. She knew that by speaking out she risked being fired in front of everyone. But he also knew he couldn't let Noah face this alone. It was time to take up the fight, as he had always done in silence, but now in front of the world. Noah, standing a few feet away from her, looked at his mother with a mixture of pride and relief. He had sustained the night with his talent, but now it was Eleanor who upheld the family's dignity. Her courage seemed greater than any humiliation Henry could try to inflict. The guests watched attentively, some visibly moved. An Italian investor discreetly wiped away a tear, touched by the scene. The contrast was stark. On one side, an arrogant, rigid millionaire who had lost control of his own party. On the other, a simple mother who had nothing but the truth to offer. And that truth, spoken in a firm voice, was more powerful than any figure on the table. It was impossible not to feel the weight of sincerity in every word Eleanor said. And for the first time, Henry Wallace didn't seem so unshakable in the face of someone who had never dared to stand up to him. Henry took a deep breath, his jaw clenched, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. He was faced with something he had never faced before. A truth that could neither be bought, nor humiliated, nor silenced. The guests, now in complete silence, awaited his reaction. But any words seemed insufficient in the face of the scene. The child prodigy and his courageous mother had turned a night of business into a moral trial. And Henry, for the first time, was not the judge, he was the judged. His hard gaze swept over the faces around him, but found only disapproval or expectation. He knew he was cornered. If he tried to ridicule Eleanor, he would completely lose the respect of his guests. If he admitted the truth, he would have to give up his pride. And as he struggled with himself, he realized that his image, built over decades, could crumble with just one poorly chosen phrase. The entire hall was waiting, and the millionaire's next move would define everything. The silence hung like a sentence when Henry Wallace finally rose from the head of the table. His face, rigid as stone, betrayed the internal struggle between pride and the truth that was imposed before him. For a moment, everyone believed he would choose arrogance once again. But when he opened his mouth, his voice was lower than usual, carrying something rare in his posture. Vulnerability. "I messed up." The words echoed like thunder throughout the hall, and the guests' immediate murmur showed their collective surprise. Henry took a deep breath and continued, each sentence seeming to be forced from within him. "I mocked a cleaning lady's son, and yet he was the one who saved this night. This boy didn't just translate words, he built bridges. Bridges I couldn't." The foreigners nodded in approval, and some even clapped, discreetly at first, but growing louder. It was the first time Henry had bowed to anyone in public. And this gesture, however late it was, carried the weight of a confession. Eleanor Brooks couldn't believe her ears. She, who had so often swallowed humiliations in silence, now watched her boss recognize out loud the value of her son. His heart was beating fast, but not from fear, from pride. Noah Brooks, still standing before the guests, maintained a serene posture, not allowing himself to be dazzled. He wasn't looking for applause, but recognition was inevitable. The Italians gave a standing ovation. The French smiled and shook their heads in admiration. The Germans murmured words of respect, and the Russians raised their glasses in an impromptu toast to the boy. The entire hall, which had previously been a scene of humiliation, now became a platform of honor for the boy. And Henry, forced to give in, declared before everyone, "From now on, there will be no room in this company for contempt. Anyone who brings value must be seen, no matter who they are." The words, though born of pressure, carried an echo of transformation, and every guest there knew they were witnessing a historic moment. The applause grew, filling the hall until it vibrated in the crystal chandeliers. Eleanor let tears run freely down her face, unafraid to hide her emotion. Noah looked at his mother, and the smile they exchanged said more than any speech. It was the silent victory of years of sacrifice, the recognition that talent does not depend on surname or wealth. Henry, in turn, sat down again, but he was no longer the same man. Pride still weighed heavily on him, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. For the first time, he saw in Eleanor and Noah not just invisible servants, but people of undeniable dignity and worth. And, although he would never admit it out loud, he knew that that night would remain etched in his memory as the most memorable of his life. The entire room vibrated with the transformation that no one expected. And the last page of that night was yet to be written. That night, when the lights went out at the Wallace Technologies skyscraper, life was never the same for anyone present. Noah Brooks, 13, walked home hand in hand with his mother, the old notebook still under his arm, but now charged with new meaning. It was no longer just a jumble of scribbles. It was the symbol that all the hidden effort had finally been seen. Eleanor walked with tears of pride, feeling that every sacrifice had been worth it. In her mind, the cruel laughter no longer mattered, because it had been silenced by her son's talent. The boy the world insisted on ignoring had earned the respect of an entire room of millionaires, and no one could take that away. In his heart, he knew this was just the beginning of a brilliant journey. Victory was not in the applause, but in restored dignity. And in the tight hug they gave at the front door, mother and son sealed the certainty that nothing would make them invisible again. The next morning, rumors of the event were already circulating among executives and international investors. The French spoke of the Garçon prodigy, the Italians remembered the Ragazzo incredible, the Germans mentioned the unglaublich kind, and the Russians commented on the. Each group described Noah with admiration, transforming the poor boy into a respected subject beyond their borders. And, ironically, Henry Wallace himself, who had begun the night as the protagonist, was now just a supporting character in the narrative of an event he could not erase. Within him, he carried the wound of pride, but also the seed of change. He knew he could no longer deny the talent that had appeared right before his eyes. And as hard as it was to admit, that night had taught him something that years of wealth had never provided: humility. The man who prided himself on controlling everything finally discovered that he had no control over genuine greatness. And that changed everything. In the simple apartment, Noah opened his notebook and, before going to sleep, scribbled a few more words in Russian, as he always did. But this time, he wrote with a confident smile, knowing that his voice had crossed borders. Eleanor, looking at her son, silently thanked him for having resisted every difficulty. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer seemed impossible. That night had proven that dreams can be born in the most unlikely places, and that even an invisible boy can shine before the world. As sleep crept in, Noah clutched the notebook to his chest, like someone hugging a passport to tomorrow. And deep in her heart, Eleanor knew nothing could erase what they had achieved. The son's talent, the mother's dignity, and the transformation of an arrogant millionaire now formed an unforgettable story. A story that would live forever in the memory of all who witnessed it. If the story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and, of course, leave a like, as this really helps the channel continue bringing you moving stories like this. Thank you so much for your support.